Greetings, comrades! Soviet education, along with free housing, healthcare, space industry and military, was one of the undoubted prides of the Soviet Union. Since coming to power, the Bolsheviks placed great emphasis on accessible and mass education. Even in the first decades, they made titanic efforts to ensure that all citizens of the country learned to at least read and write, gave access to education to representatives of minorities, were able to motivate people to study in schools and enter universities. Incidentally, we will talk about universities today. It is no secret that the USSR produced excellent specialists in the fields of natural and exact sciences. Soviet physicists, geologists, mathematicians, specialists in applied technical disciplines received an education that was undoubtedly world-class. Let's take, for example, my father. He graduated from an ordinary Soviet Polytechnic university. Let's look at his diploma, shall we? What courses did he take to get it? So, history of the CPSU, political economy, dialectical materialism, historical materialism, basics of scientific communism. Now, wait a minute, I thought he studied to be a radio engineer, not a specialist in the philosophical teachings of Marx. And let me respond to those who paused at this point and went straight to the comments to express outrage that I dared to cast aspersions on the great Soviet education right away. Once again, the USSR provided excellent and free education, including higher education. I will not claim it to be the best in the world.
Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
But it was really at the top level. And I fully agree with many of the Bolshevik decisions in the field of education. For example, the same astronomy should definitely be returned to school programs today. The Soviet universities produced excellent specialists. But was it necessary to fill their heads with 20 different compulsory courses retelling the works of Grandpa Lenin in different words? That's the question. The Soviet education system followed the tasks of upbringing and forming a person worthy of implementing the main national idea of the Soviet Union, a bright communist future for the next generations. This person began to be formed from a very young age, from kindergarten, and continued at least until the moment when a ready-made Soviet citizen graduated from school or even from university. This was the purpose of all those endless courses in Marxism-Leninism in its various forms. History, philosophy and others. But this was not the worst of it. Okay, a deeply ideologized state teaches its ideology, nothing extraordinary. The problem was that the very content of these courses often had little to do with Marx or even Lenin, but was more determined by the current slogans of the party authorities. Moreover, the ideas of Marxism-Leninism were often imbued in many other disciplines, which could not but affect the quality of their teaching. The shaping of ideology was one of the major tasks of the Soviet state in the period of 1920–1930s, and one of the most important tools in the formation of ideological attitudes in the youth of the country was, of course, education. The formation of the new man and his upbringing in the spirit of communism was to involve the entire population of the country. And the task of the education system was not only to provide knowledge, but also to discipline the new generation. Students, as the most energetic part of the population, were to be involved in the task of building communism as much as possible. Therefore, immediately after the Bolsheviks came to power, the reforms of 1918–1921 abolished the autonomy of higher educational institutions, and all university students beginning in 1921, except for Komsomol members and party members, had to submit special reports about their support of Soviet power to the United Main Political Department. And the old system of acquiring knowledge was quickly replaced by a new one based on Marxist-Leninist theory. The time allocated in the curriculum for social studies courses increased steadily and at its peak was 252 class hours per semester. The list of social disciplines included subjects related to the study of the socialist system and its economic, political and social aspects. They included mandatory sections on the philosophy of dialectical materialism, Marx's teachings on historical development, the characterization of capitalism and its contradictions, revolution and dictatorships. Some new communist universities hastily added such disciplines as history of class struggle in Russia and the West, the constitution of the USSR in connection with Lenin's doctrine of the state, political economy, History of the All-Union Communist Party Bolsheviks and the foundations of Leninism in connection with the history of the revolutionary labor movement in Russia, historical materialism, and so on. And already in 1925 they added basics of Marxism-Leninism to the list of compulsory subjects to be studied in the universities of the young Soviet country. A unified course for the entire state, which was supposed to explain the correctness and fidelity of the ideology chosen by the party. A little later in the 1930s, when the Soviet state was already 20 years old, the short course of the history of the All-Union Communist Party of Bolsheviks was published. The textbook was written under the personal supervision and possibly with the direct participation of Stalin. Around the same time, dialectical materialism, the philosophical basis of Marxism, was recognized as the official state ideology. The laws of dialectics, aka laws of philosophy, were recognized as universal and all-inclusive, capable of describing all forms of development of life and society. The negation of negation, the transition of quantity into quality, and the interpenetration of opposites, all these were not just philosophical categories. These laws explained the rightness of the party's actions and the change of capitalism to communism, which sooner or later will occur in all countries. Getting ahead of myself, I will say that this very dialectical materialism was not a literal presentation of Marx's ideas, and the content of the course itself could easily change depending on the current trends in the party leadership. And what is most amusing is that the final decision to force all Soviet university students without exception to master the most ideologized academic courses was taken not under Stalin. Moreover, it was made right after the historic 20th Congress of the CPSU, the same one at which Khrushchev sort of debunked Stalin's personality cult and returned to the path started by Grandpa Lenin. Yes, all this was done by the very same Khrushchev, who for some reason is considered by some to be almost a liberal. In 1963, the subject of scientific communism was introduced in USSR universities, and in 1964, scientific atheism was made compulsory. Initially, the course of atheism, by the way, was voluntary, but due to insufficient number of students, it became mandatory for everyone. Scientific communism was regarded as a full-fledged science, which scientifically proved the inevitability of the death of capitalism, the victory of the communist form of organization of society, and the objective nature of the historical progression towards communism. And everything, of course, was in strict accordance with the current line of the party. For example, the author of the book Historical Materialism, Konstantinov, in one of the chapters of his work, called the Yugoslav leader Tito a paid agent of the bourgeoisie. The textbook was published at the very moment when the Soviet Union established relations with Yugoslavia, and the print run had to be urgently retracted and reissued without this chapter. Then Khrushchev himself was subjected to such censorship as well. Social studies professors who in 1986 were praising Nikita Sergeevich's invaluable services in building communism, fighting for world peace and quoting his speeches on every occasion, in 1965 were already telling students about the harm of subjectivism and willful decisions in politics and economics made by our wise General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, while Khrushchev's quotes abruptly disappeared from the courses. As a result, by the 1960s-1970s, in all universities of the USSR, all students without exception were obliged to study the following subjects: history of the CPSU with compulsory writing notes of all Lenin's works, political economy, basics of scientific communism, basics of scientific atheism, and of course Marxist-Leninist philosophy, the course of which included two parts: historical and dialectical materialism. Plus, of course, philosophy, the main purpose of which was also to theoretically justify the ideas of communism. Naturally, in the late Soviet period, they were among the least favored by students. As a rule, they were far from their main specialty, detached from reality, and at the same time relatively complex, so that their study was mostly reduced to memorization of formulaic phrases and ideological formulations. Especially ironic was the subject Basics of Scientific Atheism, because it was supposed to teach future specialists not to take anything on faith, but to follow only the scientific method. But that's where the problem lies. The ideal communist in the USSR is a person who believes in the ideals of communism, otherwise it cannot be built. Yes, Marx's original concept is quite scientific, One can agree or disagree with it, and it can and should be treated critically like any other scientific concept. But in the USSR it was forbidden because Soviet dogmatists made a religion out of it, with its scriptures, cult, and attributes. Therefore, the teachings of Marx, materialistic in essence, could only be accepted on faith, because other points of view were forbidden by default. Do you see the contradictions here? In all of the above-mentioned subjects, exams were compulsory, and in scientific communism there was even a state exam, without which students were not allowed to defend their thesis and therefore could not receive a document of graduation from an institute or university. As many students recall, 90% of all these courses were reduced to memorizing the results of congresses and endless outlining of articles by Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Young communists had to always know what this or that father of the revolution had said on every topic, and specialists who had already graduated from universities were obliged to also be guided by the statements of the founders of Marxism in their research. As some researchers have calculated, during Khrushchev's time, a university student engaged in more than 5,500 academic hours during 5 years of study. The total time devoted to social sciences at non-specialized faculties and universities was about 430 hours. Consequently, about 8% of the time in the curriculum was allocated to the study of Marxist-Leninist philosophy. It doesn't seem like such a big deal, but it's also worth remembering that various aspects of Marxism-Leninism were also taught during other, core courses. For example, as academician Alexander Alexandrov wrote, when presenting experiments in which the dependence of electron mass on velocity was established, the lecturer always dwells on the philosophical significance of these data, which served as one of the starting points of Lenin's discussion with idealists at the beginning of the 20th century. The course Introduction to Biology began with the topics dialectical materialism in biology, the significance of biology for the formation of a materialist worldview, the general definition of life as a form of existence of protein bodies in exchanges with the environment according to the Engels theory, and so on. Who was affected by this whole situation the most? Strange that it may seem, not engineers, but representatives of the humanities. Technical specialists simply got extra workload, sat through a dozen useless lectures, memorized the transcript of the latest congress of the CPSU, passed the exam, and forgot about it.
Already forgot about it.
Yes, they were dissatisfied with the fact that they enrolled in a certain program for specific knowledge, and they did not think that they were supposed to be so deep in social sciences, but they accepted the rules of the game and put up with it. But for the people who chose social studies as their career path, this ideologization really damaged the quality of education. How? First of all, they had even more of these subjects, because they were supposed to become propagandists of Marxism-Leninism among the masses, and the relevant subjects occupied half of their study time, if not all of it. And let's put it simple, most of these courses were just the same words but put in different order. Or for example, take historians. From 1917 to 1934, history was not taught at all in secondary and higher schools. All history departments of universities were closed, until the Bolsheviks figured out in what way it should be taught. Later, the concept of teaching Russian history and even the history of the ancient world was based on the same short course of history of the old Union Communist Party, according to which the entire world history was presented as a process of formation of prerequisites for the revolution of 1917 and the future creation of a communist society. The Egyptians built the pyramids. This is all for the common victory of communism. Slave rebellion in ancient Rome. Spartacus had this communist spirit in him. Of course, this could not but affect the quality of education. For example, the Soviet publicist and pedagogical theorist Semyon Soloveychik, when his son entered university, prepared him for a history exam as follows. First, he narrated the entire course the way it was, and then the second time, the way one should be answering at the exam. In the teaching of economics and politics, the main role was occupied by Marxist political economy. In the teaching of philosophy, dialectical materialism, and so on. Undoubtedly, these fields should be studied by any self-respecting economist, politician, or philosopher. They are worthy of attention in their own right, but not when they are proclaimed the only true and correct ones, and all others are declared either their predecessors or just wrong, without the possibility to challenge these. The program of all these social disciplines certainly contained information about the history and current state of society. but it was the formative function that was paramount. In general, it was not a secret. Thus, the order of the Ministry of Education on the introduction of teaching the course on the basics of scientific communism in the USSR universities stated, the goal of higher and secondary specialized schools is to train highly qualified specialists for the national economy, science and culture, to form a Marxist-Leninist worldview and communist consciousness in them, to cultivate strong civic qualities. The word science was used by them as a synonym for an educational discipline, an instrument of educational influence, and not to refer to objective knowledge about some parts of the surrounding world. As a result, huge layers of scientific knowledge were either left out of the Soviet education system altogether, or were presented very sparingly and only in a highly critical manner, as bourgeois science. And this is not to mention how many highly qualified scientific and teaching personnel suffered as a result of all this ideological struggle in science and education. Entire scientific schools were lost or suppressed, and in many areas there was a noticeable lag behind world science. So, of course, the purpose of all these dialectical materialism courses is very clear. They were necessary to finalize the ideal builder of communism. Not just a person with a technical knowledge to put a brick in the foundation of this communism, but also with a clear understanding of why this brick had to be laid. Did it work? Well, as you can see, communism still hasn't been built. Thanks for watching. If you wish to support the channel financially, you can do so with crypto or by subscribing to my Patreon. And as always, a huge shout out to my biggest supporters: Yelizaveta, Kirill, Klimuk, Böse, Jimmy Albin, Petar, Ilic, Bruce Eternick and MHS. See you guys next time.